Without further ado, let's go ahead and welcome our guest speakers for this month. We're doing a Meet the Author segment. We're focusing on the book called Racing Towards Zero, The Untold Story of Driving Green. I'd like to welcome Felix Leach, who's the Associate Professor of Engineering Science at the University of Oxford, to the stage, along with Kelly Senecal, Owner and Vice President of Convergent Science. And doing the interview this month, instead of myself, we have Sherry Nagam, our publisher of SAE Books. So really excited to have all of you here. Go ahead and take it away, and I will monitor the chat window for any of the questions and make sure we pull those aside. And as a reminder to the audience, make sure you post your questions and comments for our guest speakers there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Angie. I just want to start by congratulating Kelly and Felix on the review in Forbes magazine of their book. That's terribly exciting for us. I can't imagine how excited you guys are on that one. So I want to kind of get started by telling the audience a little bit about the book. Racing Towards Zero advocates the future of mobility that requires a balanced approach between combustion engines and electrification. This is at a time when the world at large seems to believe that we need to just abandon combustion engines completely and go strictly with electrification. Kelly, can you tell me about where you think that perception started?
Yeah, first of all, Sherry, can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, awesome. And I want to thank you and Angie and everyone from SAE for having us on today. I know I don't want to speak for Felix, but we're both thrilled to be here and talk about our book, something we really enjoy talking about. So thank you very much. So let's start with that perception, and let's start from the top, right? Climate change. Clearly, it's a huge issue. And because of that, we need to decarbonize transportation along with other industries as well, as quickly as possible. The common perception, though, is that electric vehicles are zero emissions. And in fact, governments both label and regulate them that way, right? Because electric vehicles don't have a tailpipe. They are zero tailpipe emissions, but clearly they produce emissions along the way. So in the book, we talk about something called life cycle analysis, which we don't have time to get into too much of that today, but that's a tool to calculate the overall emissions from driving a car, all the way from producing the vehicle all the way to end of life. If you do an LCA properly, and that's a really loaded word to say properly because there are a lot of assumptions that go into an LCA, but you'll find that the results actually vary depending on location and application. Sometimes a hybrid electric vehicle, right? Hybrid electric vehicle has both a combustion engine and an electric motor in it. Sometimes that produces less greenhouse gas emissions. It depends on things like your electrical grid, how the battery is produced and things like that. Sometimes it is an electric vehicle, right? So it's really, this is why we advocate for a diverse mixture of the two. Most LCAs tend to compare electric vehicles with traditional internal combustion engine vehicles. And that really isn't a fair comparison because we all know that putting a small battery in the car with the combustion engine is very helpful. So that's kind of where the perception came from. And that's really why we wrote the book.
Yeah, so I think I just add to that, I agree with Kelly entirely, but I think the kind of Dieselgate scandal, what we might call the Volkswagen emissions scandal, didn't help either. It led to a mistrust, at least of certain parts of the industry. And so there was perhaps a perception that simply deleting the tailpipe would delete the emissions. But as Kelly's just been saying, in fact, all that's happening is perhaps we're moving at least some emissions elsewhere. So I think we need to be really careful about what this word zero, despite us using it in the title. But I think that's deliberately provocative in order that as you get into the book, and hopefully those of you that have had a chance to have a look or will see that actually we unpack this word zero in quite some considerable detail, because it's really important that we actually get to zero.
Absolutely. Kelly, can you talk about when you realize that someone needs to pick up the fight to educate everybody that the combustible engine is not dead, and in fact, there's a future for it? When did that become really your passion project?
That's a great question. And Felix already kind of hit on it with Dieselgate. It was really 2016. Dieselgate had recently happened. Tesla was on the rise, right? And all credit due to Tesla. They've really advanced the electric vehicle, which is very important. But the diesel engine, because of Dieselgate and engines in general, were really taking a huge hit in the media. Now, rightfully so, in a sense, there was cheating going on, right, for the emissions reporting and things like that. but to blame all of engines for that is kind of tough. So around the middle of the year, 2016, I was invited to give a TEDx talk here in Madison, Wisconsin, which is where I'm talking to you from today. I was going to do it on CFD, computational fluid dynamics, which is what my company specializes in. And then sort of as we got closer to it, I kind of pivoted. Can we still say pivot, or was that word canceled for this year? I'm not sure. But I pivoted over to combustion because I started to feel in the media a lot of heat, no pun intended. I've got all the jokes today, apparently. A lot of heat was coming on the engine, and it sort of felt like somebody needed to start saying something, right? So I did the TEDx talk. It was pretty controversial at the time, still is today, but it got a lot of good feedback on it. And that's sort of when I started to kind of go down this road. In 2017, the heat from the media kind of really intensified. I satirically call that the year combustion died. I mean, every day I'd come into work, a new country or a new automotive company would kind of say combustion's over, or they're going all electric. A lot of that really meant we're going all electrified, which is, as we unpack quite a bit in the book, the difference between electrified and electric is very important because you can hybridize an engine, hybridize a vehicle without having to go fully electric. So, so this idea that there's a one-size-fits-all solution is really kind of what prompted me to kind of defend combustion and say, wait a minute, electric is really important. It's a big piece of what we need to do going forward, but it's not the only piece.
Excellent. And Felix, I want to talk a little bit about what your path has been. While Kelly was off doing his TED Talks and really advocating that, you were approached by Professor Richard Stone, who's also an SAE author for us, longtime author, about pursuing your PhD in engine research at Jaguar. How did that experience put you on the Hug the Engine team, so to speak?
Yeah, so well over a decade ago now, Richard approached me and invited me to do a PhD with him, looking at emissions from gasoline direct injection engines, which at the time were a brand new technology. Not so much these days, although there are still plenty on the roads. And you know, that was a great 3 years experience. Like you say, Richard's a seminal figure in the community. You know, he's been an SAE author for a long time, and you know, both in Europe and I understand in the US, he's widely respected. Mm-hmm. So you know, learning from him was fantastic. But it made me understand that even in the kind of really narrow niche of a PhD, there's so much in this topic. And then when you expand further to look at the big picture, you know, about reducing pollutant emissions like certain NOx, but then also trying to get to zero CO2 quickly, there's a huge amount of potential here. And I think, you know, perhaps almost the opposite end of the spectrum to Kelly, that was really my motivating factor initially. Kelly was the one who dragged me a little bit into the public domain after he read something that I'd written to The Economist after they published an article saying that the combustion engine was dead. Well, that was now 4 or 5 years ago, and we're still going a bit. So perhaps a little bit premature, to misquote Mark Twain. But I think that one of the things that really motivates me is, and my research today, is that we've got to get CO2 reduced as quickly as possible. And I think that hybrids in particular, as Kelly's already alluded to, are a great way of kind of reducing the curve. I don't think we can wait for an all hydrogen or an all battery or an all whatever future. I think we've got to start work now as quickly as possible. And don't get me wrong, I think battery electric vehicles are fantastic. They're a great part of the solution, but I think they're only part. And I think all aspects of technology need to be working towards this as quickly as possible. And in the book, that's what we really advocate. And battery electric vehicles, hydrogen, and combustion are all part of this. And we go into all of them in the book.
Excellent. Tell me what the world looks like in 20 years if we don't achieve that balance. If we keep going in the extreme of electrification, what's it going to look like for us?
Well, I think there's a number of things. I think if we pursue the path that it seems that some people want us to pursue today, I think much like we had Dieselgate, 5-6 years ago, we might end up with BEVgate, where we have all these vehicles that are zero emissions, at least on the sticker, but actually emissions aren't falling, or at least emissions aren't falling as fast as we want them to. So I think we need to get real about emissions, and the life cycle analysis that we talk about in the book is the way we really advocate to do that. And I think we need to remember that the solutions will be different in different markets, different parts of the world. You know, one of the stats that almost blew me away when I was researching the book was nearly 1 billion people in the world don't have access to electricity. Well, they sure ain't going to be driving battery electric vehicles if they don't have access to electricity. So there's infrastructure problems to get electricity to them, as well as, you know, making sure that where battery electric vehicles are the best solution, we really make sure they get in there. But where they're not the best solution, we find the best solution for that market. And we make a number of positive suggestions to do that. I think for me, the most important thing about the book was that we advocate for realistic, positive solutions rather than just kind of complaining about the status quo.
Yeah, and I'll add a little bit to that. Felix, you summed that up really nicely. But, you know, engines aren't going away anytime soon. So I think if we go down this road, in 20 years, we're going to have a lot of 20-year-old engines on the road, right? Using 20-year-old technology. And we're kind of going to miss the opportunity to continue to improve engines, right? Make them more efficient, because there is room to make them more efficient. There is room to make them cleaner. A lot of this has to do with the fuel and not the engine itself, right? So these alternative fuels that we talk about in the book and elsewhere. So my concern is we're going to kind of miss the boat. A lot of the research dollars are going away from combustion, and I think a lot of them should go to electrification, but we still need to keep a realistic level in the combustion world. Otherwise, I think we may end up with outdated technology, and that's not going to help anybody. We also have to be careful about when CO2 is produced, right? So the upfront cost of producing EVs in terms of CO2 is much higher, right, than a combustion engine or a hybrid engine. And this has to do with the size of the battery pack. We know in the US, we love big trucks. You hear all these announcements lately about these big electric trucks coming out in the future. They use massive battery packs. So the CO2 that's created in producing those batteries is high. I'm not, you know, you can look at the book for some numbers, but you know, you can do the LCA on that. It's pretty high. And eventually you start to pay that back as you drive the car more and more. But if time really matters here, if this is an urgent problem that we have to address, dumping a bunch of CO2 in the atmosphere by creating these enormous battery packs doesn't make a lot of sense. It makes sense to a certain point, but we need to kind of balance all of this and look at it holistically so we provide kind of the best global solution.
Excellent. I want to kind of shift over to some questions we're getting in the chat. Ralph asked, if we hadn't had the emissions testing scandal, would the auto industry be where it is today? What do you think about that?
I brought this up. I think it's a great question, Ralph. You know, we can't rewrite history, I suppose, is the get out answer. But I think we would have a more balanced view. I think what the emissions testing scandal did was it really reduced trust in the public in what mainstream auto manufacturers were doing. And that's meant that they've had to basically remove the source of the problem, at least in the public's eye, i.e. the tailpipe. And so I think we'd probably have a few more tailpipes still if the emission testing scandal hadn't happened. But, you know, who knows?
The next question is from, okay, you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead.
Okay, the next question is from Anthony. He asked, did you take a look at the off-test cycle emissions for gas and diesel vehicles as part of your life cycle analysis?
So I'll start on this one. Sorry. So in the book, we really do a lot of, it's almost like a literature review of the LCA work that's been done out there. And part of the point of doing that was to highlight, as I talked about earlier, how it's kind of a loaded word doing an LCA properly. You can really get whatever answer you want, right? By how you assume, how these assumptions go into it. If you want the battery electric vehicle to look better, you certainly can do that. If you want the internal combustion engine to look better, you certainly can do that. So we really advocate for kind of more standards in place behind LCAs and kind of more fair comparisons. But we really take a look at the literature that's out there and we say, okay, let's take a look at this LCA. What assumptions did they make and how did that influence their result, right? And do we feel like that was a fair LCA or not? Really more to kind of alert the people to reading the book that you have to look at these things very carefully. In the book itself, we didn't do our own LCA, but I will say we've been doing some work on that recently with some of our colleagues that hopefully will be published soon. And that's looking in great detail on the US electrical grid. and how that influences the CO2 emissions from charging. So I didn't answer that question exactly, but hopefully that gives you some context.
This next question I really like. It's from Kevin F. It says, given the high demand for critical battery minerals and increasing battery precursor cost, what are your predictions for the HEVs and BEVs going forward?
Yeah,
Oh,
Kevin, that's a great.
Outside your realm.
Yeah, it's a great question, but I think I always wouldn't restrict it to that. You know, I think that's a really important part of battery supply, but I think also, you know, certainly from a European perspective, this is really political, right? I think answering purely from an engineering perspective might give you an answer that doesn't kind of shake out that way in the real world. Because certainly in Europe, batteries are going to be powering everything, or so the politicians tell us. So I think there is going to have to be a bit of a reckoning on that front. In the book, we certainly look at some work by a British group called Emissions Analytics that advocates for more hybrids, because effectively, while supply is constrained, you get a greater and faster CO2 reduction by putting smaller batteries into every vehicle and bigger batteries in all vehicles. But I think, you know, a bit like energy in general has governed global geopolitics for the past at least 50, arguably more years, I think battery supply is going to feed into that energy driving global geopolitics conversation in the future.
Yeah, let me just let me just add a little bit to that. There was a LinkedIn poll recently, and if you know me, you know how much I love LinkedIn polls. But I actually like this one. It said if you have a 250 kilowatt hour battery, or the resources to make a 250 kilowatt hour battery, do you want to make one electric truck? Do you want to make 12 plug-in hybrids, or do you want to make 50 what we call full hybrids in the book? And my answer is 50 hybrids, because the bang for your buck you're getting there in the CO2 reduction and how many vehicles you now spread that out on, right, it is huge. And I think it is an issue. I think we are going to see the cost of these things going up, and there's going to be issues with mining. There's so much, as Felix alluded to, there's so much that goes into this. And I think this idea that we just have an infinite supply of battery resources and just put a battery in everything, I think is dangerous.
Understood. We'll do one more question, then we have to wrap up for the day. So this is from Alexandra. It says, you mentioned the fuel as a possible area for improvement more than the engine itself. Do you think alternative combustion processes such as HCCI, PCCI, et cetera, could be a possibility in the future? I'm seeing smiles for both of you. So who wants to
Felix,
take this?
why don't you take that?
Yeah, so yes, we do think alternative combustion processes can be a possibility. In fact, in I think it's chapter 10, we go through HCCI and all these acronyms. We have a sort of acronym kind of unpacker, and we group these under a sort of what we call advanced compression ignition strategies. So HCCI, PCCI, RCCI, GCI, you name it, the acronym's probably in the book somewhere, but all in this area where we kind of unpack it. And I think this will be coupled with fuels. I think fuels will drive some of this technology, but I think as we aim for ever increased efficiencies from combustion, you know, we talk in the book about maybe heading up towards certainly above 50%, maybe even as high as 60%. It will involve some sort of advanced compression ignition process, probably, and maybe a slight change to engine architecture. So, for example, we refer to the opposed piston engine that's currently in development by Katie's Power as a potential. But I think that these developments of combustion will also go with fuels. You know, we haven't really touched on this today, but there are a lot of decarbonisation potentials through fuels such as e-fuels or hydrogen as well. Will all of those make it? I don't know, but they're certainly options, and they can be quite synergistic with these different combustion strategies.
Yeah, let me just add a little bit, because somebody just asked in the chat, what about e-fuels? And Felix, you just touched on it there. But yeah, in addition to these advanced compression ignition or these advanced combustion strategies, like Felix said, there's a lot of room for improvement with fuels. And what we have to understand is we don't need to replace the entire hydrocarbon liquid fuel base to make an impact, right? So we already see what we do with ethanol, with biofuels, right, in gasoline. So adding in some biofuels, e-fuels, we can argue about how efficient or inefficient they are to create. But, you know, there's a lot of good work going on there. And I think this is going to be part of the solution as well. So the fuel itself is a big, there's a lot of room for improvement in the fuel itself.
We've packed a lot into these few minutes. Can you end by telling me, if people walk away with one thing from this discussion, what do you want that one thing to be? I'll let both of you take that question.
How to buy our book? No.
You can do that.
And I apologize to the audience. I'm a little under the weather, so my throat's a little bit off. But I will say the takeaways, some of the same takeaways we have in the book itself. We need to rethink this idea of emissions only coming from the tailpipe, which Felix hit on earlier. I think that's a big one. There is no silver bullet solution to this problem, right? What's best in the Pacific Northwest in the US may not be best in the Midwest or best in Africa or Europe or wherever. What's best in Norway certainly isn't what's best in the US. We hear a lot about Norway and how Norway, great for Norway. They've really made it work for them, but Norway isn't the US or even Europe, the rest of Europe. I don't want to touch on all these because Felix probably will want to, but also this idea that we need to look at a technology neutral approach as we decarbonize. It feels a little bit like we lost the plot here along the way. We started out, okay, let's reduce CO2. It's important. We've kind of switched to how many EVs can we get on the road as quickly as possible? And those don't necessarily, they go together to a certain extent, but they don't necessarily completely go together. So those are the points I would like people to take away.
Yeah, and for me, it's sort of Kelly alluded to this, but let's be goal focused. The goal is to reduce CO2 as quickly as possible. Any technology that helps us do that should be on the table and should be supported. So for me, that's the biggest takeaway. But I think also the other big takeaway should be that this isn't just about engineering. This is about policy and politics as well. And we touch a bit on that, but advocacy for these approaches is really important. And I don't profess to be the expert in this, but I think pure technical solutions may not always cut it with the public, and we need to be really proactive in that approach.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time today. I appreciate it. Just a reminder, 5 winners will be chosen today at random to receive a copy of your book. Everybody else can go over and buy one for a discount. So thank you very much for your time today.
Yes, thank you, all 3 of you. That was an awesome discussion.